At just 13, the boy became a killer. His baby face masked a soul gone rotten. He plotted murder with the cold precision of someone 3 times his age, leaving his hometown horrified. Cops digging through his bedroom found his scrawled plans, sick thoughts spilled onto paper, showing how twisted ideas had wormed into his head and demanded death. Everyone figured they knew the whole ugly story until the trial, when his parents finally cracked and spilled family dirt they'd been burying for years. It was the one dark secret that explained how the kid would end up locked away for life. Layla King, a woman known for her tireless volunteer work with disabled veterans, was murdered in her small, brightly painted bungalow in the transient, end-of-the-line culture of the Florida Keys, Florida. The act was one of unimaginable cruelty, a calculated execution that bore no hallmarks of a simple robbery or a crime of passion. She had been targeted for her vulnerability, her reliance on a wheelchair making her the perfect symbol for an ideology of hate. The crime scene was a violation not just of a home, but of the very notion of sanctuary for those who had already sacrificed so much. The Florida Keys, a chain of islands where people go to escape their pasts and live by their own rules, was an unlikely backdrop for such a meticulously planned act of malice. Here, beneath the relentless sun and amidst the constant sea breeze, life was supposed to be slower, less complicated, and free from the mainland's more structured evils. Layla King had chosen this place for its peace, a quiet corner of the world where she could manage her physical therapy and continue her advocacy work remotely. Her small home, filled with books and photos of the veterans she helped, was a testament to a life lived for others, a beacon of kindness in a place often defined by its impermanence and detachment. The discovery was made by a fellow volunteer, a retired Marine who came to check on Layla when she missed their daily morning phone call for 2 days in a row. He found the front door unlocked, which was not entirely unusual in the trusting, close-knit community of their specific key. What he found inside, however, would forever alter the island's perception of itself and the safety it promised. The scene was not one of chaos, but of a chilling and deliberate order, an arrangement that spoke to a perpetrator who had not been rushed, who had savored the moments of the crime. The initial responding officers from the Monroe County Sheriff's Office were struck by the profound stillness of the bungalow, a silence made heavier by the cheerful colors of the walls and the gentle sound of wind chimes on the porch. There was no sign of forced entry, suggesting the killer had either been invited in or had found a way to enter without violence, perhaps by exploiting Layla's inherent trust in others. The victim was found in her living room, positioned in a way that was clearly meant to be a statement, a grotesque tableau of contempt. It was immediately clear to the seasoned officers that this was not a random act but a message, and their first task was to decipher what that hateful message was. Layla King had moved to the Keys 5 years prior, seeking a warmer climate that would be kinder to her body, which had been confined to a wheelchair after a devastating car accident a decade earlier. Despite her limitations, she was a force of nature, a woman whose spirit refused to be contained by her physical circumstances. She ran a small nonprofit from her home, connecting recently returned veterans suffering from both physical and psychological wounds with resources, therapy, and most importantly, a sense of community. She was, by all accounts, a secular saint, a person who had transformed her own tragedy into a lifeline for others. Her work was her entire life, a mission that gave her purpose and connected her to a network of grateful and protective individuals across the country. Her neighbors knew her as the kind woman with the bright smile who always had a supportive word for everyone, the one who organized community potlucks and remembered everyone's birthday. Her murder was therefore not just an attack on an individual, but an assault on the very heart of the community she had so carefully nurtured. It created a wound that felt personal to everyone who had ever been touched by her generosity and strength. The brutality of the crime was clinical and precise, lacking the frenzied energy of a passionate outburst. The evidence suggested a killer who was calm, methodical, and operating from a script of their own creation, a script rooted in an ideology that viewed Layla's very existence as an offense. The symbolism of the crime scene, which detectives would spend weeks deconstructing, pointed toward a motive that was abstract, intellectual, and utterly divorced from any personal conflict with the victim. This was a hate crime of a different sort, one aimed not at a group defined by race or religion, but at a concept, the perceived weakness, Layla's disability, represented in the killer's twisted worldview. The investigation began by looking at the people closest to Layla, a standard procedure that felt almost profane given the nature of her life and work. Detectives interviewed the veterans she helped, the neighbors she charmed, and the few distant family members she kept in contact with. Each interview painted the same picture of a woman without enemies, a person who moved through the world with a grace and kindness that seemed to insulate her from the everyday conflicts that could escalate into violence. This absence of a conventional motive only deepened the mystery and heightened the sense of dread that had settled over the islands. The first lead came not from an interview or a forensic finding, but from a quiet observation by a neighbor 2 houses down. He remembered seeing a young boy on a bicycle riding slowly past Layla's house several times a week for the past month, an unusual sight in a neighborhood primarily occupied by retirees and vacationers. The boy never stopped and never spoke to anyone, but he watched the house with an intensity that the neighbor now in retrospect found deeply unsettling. He was just a kid, and his presence was easy to dismiss, but the memory had lodged itself in the neighbor's mind. This seemingly insignificant detail opened up an entirely new and disturbing avenue for the investigation. The focus shifted from Layla's adult world of advocacy and community to the local schools and teenage social circles, a world investigators had no reason to suspect. They began pulling surveillance footage from the one convenience store on the Key, painstakingly reviewing hours of grainy video in search of a boy on a bicycle. The search was a long shot, a desperate attempt to give form to the phantom who had brought such darkness to their shores. Meanwhile, the autopsy report confirmed the investigators' worst fears about the perpetrator's mindset. The medical examiner detailed a death that was caused not by a swift, merciful blow, but by a series of precise, calculated actions designed to inflict suffering while leaving minimal forensic evidence. It was the work of someone who had studied anatomy, who understood the mechanics of pain and fear, and who had executed their plan with a surgeon's detachment. The report painted a portrait of a monster, and now, with the neighbor's tip, the investigators were forced to consider the unthinkable that this monster might be a child. The breakthrough came after 3 days of relentless video review. A detective spotted him, a boy on a bicycle, matching the neighbor's description, captured for a few seconds as he bought a soda at the convenience store 2 weeks before the murder. He was nondescript, with shaggy brown hair and a blank expression, but the store's camera was clear enough to get a usable image of his face. They now had a face to go with the ghost, and the image was distributed to every law enforcement officer and school resource officer in the county. The identification came quickly. A school resource officer at the local middle school recognized the boy instantly. His name was Joshua Ramirez, a 13-year-old student with no disciplinary record, average grades, and a reputation for being quiet and reserved. He lived with his family in a modest home on a neighboring Key, a world away from the retiree community where Layla King had made her home. There was nothing in his official record to suggest he was capable of anything more than adolescent moodiness. When lead detective Patrick Phillips and his partner arrived at the Ramirez home, they were met with a baffling sense of normalcy. The lawn was neatly trimmed, a string of seashells hung on the porch, and through the window they could see a family sitting down to dinner. It was a picture of suburban tranquility that seemed impossible to reconcile with the chilling crime they were investigating. They were there to question a 13-year-old boy about the murder of a disabled woman, and the sheer domesticity of the scene felt like a surreal and jarring contradiction. Joshua's parents were cooperative but bewildered, insisting that the detectives must have made some kind of terrible mistake. Their son was a good boy, they said, quiet and a little strange perhaps, but not violent. Joshua himself was brought into the living room, and he met the detective's gaze with a calm, unwavering stare that was unnerving in its lack of emotion. He was just a boy, small for his age, yet he projected an aura of cold confidence that made the hair on Detective Phillips' arms stand up. The detectives began their questioning gently, asking Joshua where he had been on the days of the murder. He answered their questions without hesitation, providing a detailed and plausible alibi that involved being at home, reading in his room. He denied knowing Layla King, denied ever being in her neighborhood, and denied being the boy on the bicycle. He was a convincing liar, his story delivered with a placid certainty that would have been believable if not for the cold, dead look in his eyes. The interview was a masterclass in juvenile sociopathy. Joshua showed no signs of fear, no anxiety, no indignation at being accused of such a monstrous act. He was simply patient, as if he were waiting for the adults to finish their pointless game so he could get back to more important things. It was this profound emotional disconnect, more than any piece of evidence, that convinced Detective Phillips he was sitting across from a killer. He had seen that same empty look in the eyes of hardened criminals, but never in the face of a 13-year-old child. The detectives left the Ramirez home with a search warrant and a deep sense of unease. They had found their monster, but they had also uncovered a more frightening mystery: how a seemingly normal boy from a seemingly normal family could become capable of such a cold and calculated act of evil. As they began their search of Joshua's room, they knew they were not just looking for evidence of a crime, but for the answer to a question that struck at the heart of their understanding of human nature. The transient culture of the Keys was used to people escaping their pasts, but it was entirely unprepared for a child who had no past to escape from, only a dark and terrifying future of his own creation. The search of Joshua Ramirez's bedroom was a descent into a meticulously organized mind, a space that was less a child's sanctuary and more a zealot's temple. Everything was neat, ordered and categorized with an obsessive precision that was profoundly unsettling. But it was what the search uncovered on his computer and in a locked journal hidden beneath a loose floorboard that transformed the case from a horrifying murder into a declaration of ideological war. The writings revealed a boy who had spent years cultivating a philosophy of hate, a self-radicalized lone wolf who saw himself as a soldier fighting against a world corrupted by weakness. The arrest was made the following morning at the family home, a quiet and surreal affair that stood in stark contrast to the violent ideology that had prompted it. Joshua showed no emotion as the handcuffs were placed on his wrists, his expression a flat, unreadable mask of calm. His parents were a wreck of confusion and denial, their suburban world crumbling around them as they watched their son, their quiet, bookish boy, being led away by police for a crime they could not comprehend. Joshua, however, seemed to view the entire process with a detached, almost academic interest, as if he were observing a fascinating but ultimately predictable social ritual. In the interrogation room, a space designed to intimidate and disorient, Joshua Ramirez was utterly unmoved. He sat at the metal table, his small frame almost swallowed by the adult-sized chair, and regarded Detective Phillips with a look of mild disdain. When the detective began the interview, Joshua held up a hand to stop him, a gesture of such startling authority from a child that it momentarily stunned the room into silence. It was then that the confession began, but it was not a confession of guilt in any legal or moral sense. It was a lecture, a prepared statement delivered with the passionless cadence of a student reading a book report. Joshua Ramirez refused to acknowledge the legitimacy of the police, the law, or the entire judicial system, launching into an infuriating and nonsensical legal argument. He informed Detective Phillips that he was a sovereign individual, not subject to the statutes and ordinances of what he called the corporate fiction of the United States government. He declared that he did not recognize the detective's authority and would not answer any questions, as doing so would be entering into a contract with a system he did not recognize. The performance was bizarre, infuriating, and clearly rehearsed. For nearly an hour, Joshua spouted a garbled manifesto of pseudo-legal jargon and extremist philosophy, a worldview cobbled together from the darkest corners of the Internet. He spoke of the tyranny of the weak and the biological imperative of the strong to cull the herd, a chillingly Darwinian philosophy that he had twisted into a justification for murder. Layla King, he explained without a hint of remorse, was not a person but a symbol, a representation of the societal decay he felt he was divinely appointed to correct. Detective Phillips, a veteran of hundreds of interrogations, had never encountered anything like it. He had dealt with liars, brutes, and psychopaths, but he had never faced a 13-year-old ideologue who had so thoroughly dehumanized his victim that he could speak of her murder as a necessary and logical act of social hygiene. The boy's refusal to engage on a human level, his insistence on retreating into the fortress of his twisted ideology, was a tactic more effective than any stony silence. He wasn't just denying his guilt, he was denying the very framework of morality that made his act a crime in the first place. The sovereign citizen's defense, as detectives knew it, was a common tactic among a certain type of anti-government extremist, but it was unheard of in a suspect so young. It spoke to a level of indoctrination and a degree of isolation that was difficult to fathom. Joshua had not just committed a murder, he had built an entire intellectual universe to justify it, a reality-proof bubble where his actions were not only acceptable but heroic. He was not confessing to a crime, he was announcing his mission statement to a world he held in utter contempt. Throughout the lengthy and maddening monologue, Joshua's demeanor never changed. He remained calm, articulate, and condescending, occasionally sighing with theatrical impatience, as if he were disappointed by the detective's inability to grasp his supposedly brilliant philosophical concepts. There were no tears, no flashes of anger, no cracks in the facade of his cold, intellectual superiority. He was a perfect and terrifying vessel for the hate he had absorbed, a child whose innocence had been hollowed out and replaced with a rigid and unyielding doctrine of cruelty. The interrogation ended not with a breakthrough, but with an impasse. Joshua Ramirez had confessed to the act of killing Layla King, but he refused to admit to the crime of murder. In his mind, he was a political actor, a revolutionary, and his actions were not subject to the judgment of a system he deemed corrupt and illegitimate. He was, in his own twisted narrative, a prisoner of war, and his calm, defiant performance in the interrogation room was the first battle in his self-declared war against society. The legal ramifications of his performance were complex. While his lecture was a de facto confession, his refusal to acknowledge the legal system presented a unique challenge for the prosecution. They were not dealing with a typical juvenile delinquent who could be scared or reasoned with. They were dealing with a true believer, a 13-year-old extremist who was fully prepared to use his trial as a platform to broadcast his hateful ideology to the world. As Joshua was led from the interrogation room to a juvenile holding cell, he passed a window where his parents were speaking with a lawyer, their faces masks of anguish. He looked at them, not with affection or regret, but with the same detached pity he had shown Detective Phillips, the look of a superior being observing the emotional frailties of a lesser species. He was completely and utterly alone in his self-made world, a sovereign nation of one, and his only allegiance was to the monstrous ideas that now defined his entire existence. The officers who had watched the interrogation were left shaken and deeply disturbed. They had arrested a child, but they had interrogated a monster, a creature whose humanity seemed to have been surgically removed. The easy, transient culture of the Keys had always attracted people who wanted to live by their own rules, but Joshua Ramirez had taken that ethos to a dark and terrifying extreme. He had not just broken the rules, he had rewritten them, crafting a personal code that permitted the ultimate act of violence and called it virtue. With Joshua Ramirez in custody, his bizarre sovereign citizen's confession providing a clear but legally problematic admission, the prosecution's focus shifted to understanding the path of his radicalization. Prosecutor Edward Morris knew that a jury would struggle to comprehend how a 13-year-old boy could arrive at such a monstrous philosophy on his own. He tasked Detective Phillips with a deep forensic excavation of Joshua's life, not just to build the case for murder, but to construct a narrative that could explain the inexplicable. The key, they believed, lay in the digital world where Joshua had spent the vast majority of his young life. The forensic analysis of Joshua's computer was a journey into the echo chamber of online extremism. His search history, chat logs, and downloads painted a portrait of a lonely and impressionable boy who had been systematically groomed by online hate groups. He had started with mainstream political commentary, then moved to more extreme forums, and had eventually found a home in the darkest, most nihilistic corners of the internet where violence was glorified and empathy was mocked as a weakness. It was a textbook case of online radicalization, a slow and steady poisoning of a young mind. The most crucial piece of evidence, however, was not digital. It was a collection of several spiral-bound notebooks found hidden in a vent in Joshua's bedroom, a handwritten manifesto that was far more shocking than his online activities. In these journals, written in a neat and precise script, investigators found the written manifesto of Joshua Ramirez. It was a diary where the perpetrator detailed his twisted worldview and fantasized about the murder for months. A chillingly lucid account of his descent into a philosophy of pure hatred and his meticulous planning of the crime. The manifesto was a terrifying blend of adolescent angst and genocidal philosophy, a document that charted his intellectual and emotional journey from a disaffected middle schooler to a self-proclaimed soldier in a war against modernity. He wrote of his disgust for his peers, his contempt for his teachers, and his profound sense of alienation from a world he saw as weak, sentimental, and corrupt. He was building a case for his own superiority, piece by painstaking piece, creating a justification for the violence he believed was his destiny to unleash. Over hundreds of pages, Joshua laid out his grand theory of societal decay, a philosophy heavily plagiarized from various extremist texts he had found online. He believed that society was being crippled by its compassion for the weak and that true progress required the culling of those he deemed unfit. His list of the unfit was long and horrifying, but he had a special venomous hatred for the disabled, whom he saw as the ultimate symbol of a society that celebrated dependency over strength. His writings were filled with a cold biological cruelty, the detached language of a eugenicist. The journals also served as a practical workbook for murder. Joshua had spent months researching methods, studying anatomy charts, and drawing diagrams of crime scenes. He meticulously planned every detail of the attack on Layla King, from his surveillance of her home to the specific methods he would use to kill her. He had chosen her not for any personal reason, but because she was the perfect target for his ideological statement, a disabled woman who was nevertheless a pillar of her community, a symbol of the compassionate society he so desperately wanted to destroy. The level of planning was staggering for a boy of 13. He had created checklists, practiced tying knots, and even rehearsed the pseudo-legal sovereign citizen speech he had delivered to Detective Phillips. The manifesto was not just a fantasy, it was a blueprint, a step-by-step guide to his first act as a self-appointed agent of societal change. Reading the journal was like watching the crime unfold in slow motion, a premeditated act of evil that had been born, nurtured, and perfected in the quiet solitude of his bedroom. For prosecutor Edward Morris, the manifesto was the Rosetta Stone of the case. It provided the irrefutable evidence of premeditation that would be necessary to try Joshua as an adult. More importantly, it provided the motive, the why behind the monstrous act. Joshua had not killed out of anger or greed or any of the common human failings that lead to violence. He had killed as an act of faith, a bloody sacrifice to the god of his own hateful ideology. The journals also revealed a chilling and deliberate process of self-dehumanization. In his earliest entries, there were flashes of a recognizable child, mentions of video games, complaints about homework, and feelings of loneliness. But as the months went on, this child was systematically erased, replaced by the cold, analytical voice of the ideologue. He began referring to himself in the third person, as the agent or the corrector, and to other people as specimens or units. He was actively and consciously stripping himself of his own humanity to make the act of killing possible. This transformation was the most terrifying aspect of the entire case. Joshua Ramirez was not a monster who had been born without a conscience. He was a child who had methodically and deliberately carved out his own soul and replaced it with a doctrine of hate. The manifesto was the record of that terrible surgery, a self-inflicted wound from which he could never recover. It was proof that the most dangerous monsters are not the ones who are born, but the ones who are made. The discovery of the manifesto fundamentally changed the prosecution's strategy. This was no longer just a murder trial, it was a case about the seductive and destructive power of extremist ideologies in the digital age. Edward Morris knew he had to present Joshua not as a misguided child, but as a willing and intelligent convert to a philosophy of hate, a young man who had made a conscious and deliberate choice to embrace evil. The journals were the prosecution's star witness, a voice from Joshua's own hand that would condemn him more completely than any eyewitness ever could. As the contents of the manifesto were cataloged and prepared for trial, a heavy sense of tragedy settled over the investigative team. They had found the answers they were looking for, but those answers were more disturbing than the crime itself. The murder of Layla King was not an isolated act of violence, but the symptom of a much deeper sickness, a cancer of hatred that could grow undetected in the quiet corners of society, turning a lonely boy into a cold-blooded killer. The Florida Keys had always been a place for reinvention, but the manifesto of Joshua Ramirez was a chilling testament to the fact that sometimes when you create a new identity, you are simply building a more elaborate cage for the monster that was there all along. In the months leading up to the trial, as the legal system grappled with the unprecedented challenge of prosecuting a 13-year-old ideologue as an adult, Joshua Ramirez's behavior in juvenile detention only served to reinforce the prosecution's narrative of a remorseless and manipulative killer. Stripped of his computer and his notebooks, he sought a new outlet for his sense of superiority and his contempt for authority. He found it in the relationship with his court-appointed defense attorney, a seasoned and compassionate public defender named Michael Thorne. Thorne was a man who believed deeply in the potential for rehabilitation, especially for juvenile offenders. He approached Joshua's case with a genuine desire to understand the boy behind the monstrous act, hoping to find a flicker of the child who had been lost to the poison of online extremism. What he found instead was a black hole of narcissism, a client who viewed him not as an advocate but as another tool to be manipulated and an intellectual inferior to be scorned. The pretrial hearings became a stage for Joshua's defiance of counsel. He openly mocked his own lawyer in meetings, laughing at his advice and making the legal team's job impossible. Thorne would attempt to explain legal strategy to prepare Joshua for the grueling process of a murder trial, and Joshua would respond with eye rolls, theatrical sighs, and condescending corrections of Thorne's grammar. He treated the entire process as a tedious game, a bureaucratic formality that was beneath his intellectual station. Joshua insisted on dictating the defense strategy himself, a strategy rooted in his bizarre sovereign citizen's philosophy. He demanded that Thorne file frivolous and nonsensical motions challenging the court's very jurisdiction, motions that Thorne knew would be immediately dismissed and would only serve to anger the judge. When Thorne refused, explaining that such a strategy was legal suicide, Joshua would accuse him of being an agent of the state and a traitor to the cause of individual liberty. The relationship between client and counsel became a bitter and exhausting battle of wills. The most shocking displays of contempt occurred during their private meetings. On one occasion, Thorne was attempting to explain the concept of a plea bargain, the possibility of avoiding a life sentence in exchange for a guilty plea. Joshua listened patiently, a faint smirk on his face before responding. He told Thorne that he would never plead guilty because he had done nothing wrong. He then proceeded to lecture his own lawyer for nearly half an hour on the moral and philosophical necessity of his actions, a chilling reprise of the speech he had given to Detective Phillips. Another time, as Thorne was trying to prepare Joshua for the emotional impact of the victim's family's testimony, Joshua interrupted him. He pulled out a piece of paper and a pencil and began to draw. When Thorne asked what he was doing, Joshua slid the paper across the table. It was a crude, violent caricature of Layla King, a drawing filled with a hateful and mocking cruelty that left the seasoned public defender speechless and sick to his stomach. Joshua had not just killed her, he was still killing her again and again in the privacy of his own malevolent imagination. The legal team was in an impossible position. They were ethically bound to provide a vigorous defense for their client, but their client seemed determined to sabotage his own case at every turn. His refusal to show any remorse, his open contempt for his own lawyers, and his unwavering commitment to his hateful ideology made it impossible to construct any kind of sympathetic narrative for the jury. Joshua was not an unwilling participant in his own defense. He was its chief saboteur, a one-man wrecking crew for his own future. Michael Thorne made repeated, desperate attempts to break through the wall of Joshua's ideology. He tried to talk to him about normal teenage things, music, movies, school, hoping to find a crack in the facade, a hint of the boy he used to be. But Joshua would always steer the conversation back to his manifesto, to his grand theories of societal collapse and his role as a self-appointed savior. He was a prisoner of his own ideas, so completely trapped in the intellectual fortress he had built that he was no longer capable of genuine human connection. The situation came to a head during a final strategy meeting before the trial was set to begin. Thorne laid out the defense he was legally obligated to present, a defense centered on Joshua's age, his susceptibility to online brainwashing, and a plea for treatment rather than lifelong incarceration. It was a long shot, but it was the only viable path. Joshua listened to the entire plan in silence, his expression unreadable. When Thorne was finished, Joshua looked him in the eye and laughed, a short, sharp bark of a laugh that was filled with pure, unadulterated contempt. "You're a fool," Joshua said, his voice flat and cold. "You still think this is about me. This isn't about saving a child, it's about announcing a new world order. He then informed Thorne that if he tried to portray him as a victim or as mentally incompetent, he would stand up in court and fire him on the spot, then proceed to represent himself. It was not a threat. It was a promise, a final, definitive declaration that he was in control of his own narrative, even if that narrative led directly to a life sentence. Michael Thorne, a man who had defended the most hardened and hopeless cases, left that meeting feeling a profound sense of defeat. He was not defending a client. He was a reluctant stagehand in a play written, directed, and starring a 13-year-old monster, a play that could only end in tragedy. The trial of Joshua Ramirez began on a sweltering summer morning in the Monroe County Courthouse, the oppressive humidity outside mirroring the tense, suffocating atmosphere within. The courtroom was packed, a silent and somber audience of journalists, legal observers, and community members still reeling from the sheer brutality of the crime. At the defendant's table, Joshua sat with a preternatural calm, his hands folded neatly in front of him, his expression one of bored detachment. He looked less like a child on trial for his life and more like a visiting scholar observing a quaint local custom. Prosecutor Edward Morris, a man known for his methodical and understated style, began his opening statement with a quiet, devastating act of stagecraft. He placed a single, beautiful photograph of Layla King on an easel facing the jury, a picture of her in her wheelchair on the beach, laughing into the sunlight. "This was Layla King," he said, his voice filled with a controlled sadness. "And the evidence will show that the defendant, Joshua Ramirez, murdered her for one reason and one reason only, because he hated the light she brought into the world." The prosecution's first witness was Layla's mother, an elderly woman whose grief was a palpable presence in the room. She spoke in a soft, trembling voice, telling the jury about her daughter's courage, her resilience, and her unwavering commitment to helping others. She spoke of the daily challenges Layla faced and the grace with which she met them, painting a portrait of a hero who had already overcome so much, only to be struck down by an act of senseless, incomprehensible hatred. It was during this heartbreaking testimony that the breaking point came. As Layla's mother began to weep on the stand, her voice cracking as she described her last phone call with her daughter, a sound cut through the respectful silence of the courtroom. It was a short, sharp, ugly sound. A laugh. Every head turned to the defendant's table, where Joshua Ramirez was sitting with a broad, chilling smirk on his face, his eyes fixed on the grieving mother with a look of open, triumphant contempt. The courtroom erupted. A wave of horrified gasps and angry murmurs swept through the gallery. The judge slammed his gavel, his face a mask of cold fury, but the damage was done. In that single, horrifying moment, Joshua had confirmed every terrible thing the prosecution had said about him. He was not a misguided child, he was a monster, a creature so devoid of empathy that the profound, sacred sorrow of a mother was nothing more than a source of private amusement to him. The outburst was just the beginning of Joshua's campaign of psychological warfare from the defendant's table. As the trial progressed, he engaged in a series of small, cruel acts designed to terrorize the witnesses and mock the proceedings. He would tap out complex, distracting rhythms on the table during forensic testimony. He would make grotesque, exaggerated faces at the jury when he thought the judge wasn't looking. He was turning the most solemn of legal proceedings into his own private circus, and he was the gleeful, malevolent ringmaster. His own lawyer, Michael Thorne, was powerless to stop him. He would plead with Joshua in whispered, frantic tones to show some respect, to project some semblance of humanity, but his words were met with the same smirk, the same cold, dead eyes. Joshua was enjoying himself, reveling in the attention and the power he felt he wielded over the emotions of everyone in the room. This was not a trial to him, it was a performance, and he was delivering the performance of a lifetime. The effect on the jury was profound and undeniable. They had been instructed to presume his innocence, to judge him based on the evidence alone, but his behavior in the courtroom was a form of evidence in itself. They watched him, their expressions hardening from sympathy for his youth into a cold, unified disgust. They were not just seeing a defendant, they were seeing evil in its purest, most arrogant form, a 13-year-old boy who had appointed himself judge, jury, and executioner, and who was now laughing at the system that had finally called him to account. The incident with Layla's mother became the defining moment of the trial's opening days. It was reported in every newspaper and on every news broadcast, the story of the smirking child killer who laughed at a mother's tears. Any slim hope the defense had of portraying Joshua as a redeemable, brainwashed youth was annihilated by his own actions. He had, with a single cruel laugh, authored his own conviction in the court of public opinion and likely in the minds of the 12 people who held his future in their hands. Prosecutor Edward Morris, while professionally disgusted, recognized the strategic gift Joshua had given him. He didn't have to convince the jury that the defendant was a monster. Joshua was doing it for him day after day, with every smirk, every eye roll, and every gesture of profound contempt. The trial had become a battle not over facts, but over souls, a direct confrontation between the quiet dignity of a grieving family and the loud, ugly, and performative evil of a 13-year-old killer. And from the very first day, it was clear which side was winning. The transient, rule-averse culture of the Keys had produced a boy who believed he was above all rules, and his trial was a grim public demonstration of just how far a human being could fall when they decided they were no longer bound by the basic tenets of decency and compassion. As the trial entered its second week, the prosecution methodically laid out the physical and digital evidence that connected Joshua Ramirez to the crime scene, creating an irrefutable chain of premeditation and guilt. They presented the grainy convenience store footage of Joshua on his bicycle, the forensic link between fibers found on the scene and clothing from his room, and the damning digital footprint of his online radicalization. But the emotional core of the prosecution's case, the evidence that would strip away the final layers of Joshua's monstrous ideology and expose the human cost of his actions, came from a place no one expected: the victim herself. Detective Phillips had discovered a small leather-bound journal tucked away in a drawer in Layla King's bedside table. It was not a diary of her fears or a record of her daily struggles, but a gratitude journal, a place where she had made a daily practice of writing down the small joys and blessings of her life. Prosecutor Edward Morris made the controversial decision to have excerpts of this journal read aloud in court, a move that would allow the victim to speak directly to the jury from beyond the grave. The task of reading the diary fell to a young female prosecutor on Morris's team, who approached the lectern with a heavy sense of purpose. As she began to read, a profound and heartbreaking silence fell over the courtroom. Layla's words, simple and unadorned, painted a portrait of a woman who, despite her immense physical challenges, possessed a spirit of boundless optimism and a deep appreciation for the beauty of the world around her. She wrote of the joy of feeling the sun on her face during her morning therapy sessions on the porch, of the kindness of the neighbor who brought her fresh mangoes, of the satisfaction of connecting a struggling veteran with a PTSD support group. Her entries were a litany of small graces, a testament to a life lived with an open and generous heart. The diary was a weapon of pure goodness, a powerful and poignant refutation of the dark nihilistic worldview that had led to her murder. The most devastating entry was from the week before her death. In it, Layla wrote about seeing a young boy on a bicycle riding past her house. She didn't write of fear or suspicion, but of a maternal concern. She wrote that he looked lonely and sad, and she made a note to herself to try and say hello to him the next time she saw him, to offer him a glass of lemonade, to see if he needed someone to talk to. She had seen the boy who was plotting her murder and had responded not with fear, but with the same compassion she showed to everyone. As these words were read, the emotional weight in the courtroom became almost unbearable. Jurors openly wept, their professional detachment washed away by the raw, undeniable humanity of Layla's character. The entry was a gut punch, a perfect and tragic encapsulation of the crime. A monster had targeted a saint, and the saint's only impulse had been to try and save him. It was a moment of profound, almost biblical tragedy, the ultimate confrontation between good and evil. During the reading, Joshua Ramirez, for the first time, seemed to lose his composure. His confident smirk faltered, replaced by a look of confusion and then a flash of pure, venomous rage. Layla's diary was an attack he had not anticipated, a form of evidence his ideology had no defense against. He had reduced her to a symbol, a thing, but her own words had resurrected her in the courtroom as a vibrant, complex, and deeply good human being. Her diary was dismantling his entire philosophical justification for the murder, not with legal arguments, but with the simple, undeniable power of her own goodness. The diary's impact was magnified by its stark contrast with the other journal in the case, Joshua's own manifesto of hate. The prosecution had already introduced excerpts of Joshua's writings, his cold, academic prose about the necessity of culling the weak. Now the jury was hearing the voice of his victim, a voice filled with warmth, gratitude, and a love for the very life Joshua had deemed worthless. The two diaries, read side by side, were a perfect and horrifying dialogue between light and darkness. The prosecution rested its case after the final diary entry was read, a strategic decision by Edward Morris to let Layla's own words be the last thing the jury heard. The evidence had been presented, the timeline established, and the motive laid bare. But it was the quiet, hopeful voice from a worn leather journal that had delivered the most damning indictment. It had not just proven Joshua's guilt, it had revealed the true and staggering depth of his depravity. He had not just extinguished a life, he had sought to extinguish a light, and the diary was proof that even in death, that light refused to be put out. The transient, often cynical culture of the Florida Keys had been forced to confront a crime that defied easy explanation. But in the words of Layla King's gratitude journal, the community found a reflection of its own better self, a reminder of the quiet kindness and resilience that existed beneath the surface of its end-of-the-line reputation. The diary had become more than evidence. It was a eulogy, a final, beautiful, and heartbreaking gift from a woman whose spirit was too strong to be silenced by an act of hate. The defense for Joshua Ramirez was faced with an almost insurmountable task. The prosecution had presented a mountain of evidence, and Joshua's own behavior in court had alienated the jury beyond measure. The defense attorney, Michael Thorne, was left with only one viable strategy: to argue that Joshua, due to his age and a lifetime of subtle but profound psychological manipulation by his family, lacked the moral culpability to be tried as an adult. It was a desperate gambit, one that required painting a picture of Joshua as a victim, a narrative that would spectacularly and catastrophically implode. The defense's case rested on the testimony of character witnesses who were meant to portray Joshua as a normal, if slightly awkward, young boy. They called teachers who spoke of his average grades and quiet demeanor. They called neighbors who described him as polite and reserved. The strategy was to create a jarring disconnect between the boy they knew and the monster described by the prosecution, to plant a seed of doubt that a child could truly be responsible for such a sophisticated and evil act. The turning point came when the defense called their star character witness to the stand, a close family friend named Susan Peters, a woman who had known Joshua since he was a baby. She was meant to be the linchpin of their strategy, a warm, maternal figure who could speak to the loving and normal environment in which Joshua was raised. She began her testimony as planned, describing Joshua as a sweet, intelligent child who was perhaps a little too solitary for his own good. Under direct examination, she was a compelling witness, her words painting a picture that was difficult to reconcile with the boy smirking at the defendant's table. But the facade began to crumble under the precise and methodical cross-examination of prosecutor Edward Morris. Morris did not attack her character or her testimony directly. Instead, he began asking her a series of seemingly innocuous questions about Joshua's childhood, his hobbies, and his relationship with his father. The character witness backfired in the most dramatic way imaginable. When Morris asked Susan Peters about a specific family camping trip from several years earlier, a trip she had mentioned in her direct testimony as a happy memory, her composure cracked. Morris, sensing a weakness, pressed her for details. With a series of gentle but relentless questions, he led her to recount a story she had clearly intended to suppress, a story that would unravel the defense's entire narrative. With tears welling in her eyes, Susan Peters admitted that the camping trip had ended in a deeply disturbing incident. She tearfully recounted how she had discovered a 10-year-old Joshua in the woods, where he had trapped and was meticulously and sadistically torturing a squirrel. She described the look in his eyes, a cold, clinical curiosity, a complete absence of empathy that had terrified her at the time. She had told Joshua's father, who had dismissed it as boys being boys, a harmless if gruesome phase. The revelation sent a shockwave through the courtroom. It was a single, vivid anecdote that completely shattered the defense's portrayal of Joshua as a normal child. This was not the act of a typical boy, it was a classic warning sign of a budding psychopath, an early experiment in the mechanics of cruelty that had been witnessed, reported, and then utterly ignored by the adults in his life. The story was a small window into the hidden darkness that had been festering in Joshua for years, a darkness that his family had chosen to look away from. The damage was immediate and irreparable. The witness, who had been called to attest to Joshua's good character, had instead provided the prosecution with a perfect and horrifying origin story for their monster. Her testimony, intended to save him, had instead condemned him, proving that his capacity for cold, calculated cruelty was not a new development born of online manifestos, but a deep-seated part of his character that had been present since childhood. During his witness's catastrophic testimony, Joshua's reaction was telling. He did not look ashamed or angry. He looked proud. He met Susan Peters' tearful gaze with a small, triumphant smile, as if he were pleased that his earliest work was finally getting the recognition he felt it deserved. His reaction was a silent and terrifying confirmation of the story, an admission of guilt written in the language of pure, unrepentant narcissism. Michael Thorne could only watch as his case disintegrated. He had been blindsided, betrayed by a witness he had trusted, and a history he had not known. The story of the squirrel was more than just a damaging piece of testimony. It was the missing piece of the puzzle, the moment that connected the quiet, awkward boy to the cold-blooded killer. The defense's narrative had not just failed, it had been turned into a weapon for the prosecution. The attempt to paint Joshua as a victim had only succeeded in proving, beyond any reasonable doubt, that he had been a predator in the making all along. The Florida Keys, a place where so many came to hide from their past, had become the stage where Joshua's own hidden past was finally and devastatingly brought into the light. The trial had taken a heavy emotional toll on everyone in the courtroom. The constant exposure to Joshua Ramirez's chilling ideology, the heartbreaking details of Layla King's life and death, and the daily spectacle of the defendant's remorseless contempt had created an atmosphere of profound and weary sadness. The breaking point, the moment when the accumulated weight of the tragedy became too much to bear, arrived not with a dramatic outburst or a shocking revelation, but during the quiet, methodical testimony of a forensic accountant. The accountant was the prosecution's final witness, called to the stand to detail the contents of Layla King's financial records. The purpose of his testimony was simple: to refute any potential defense argument that Layla was in financial distress, a tactic sometimes used to suggest a motive for suicide or a secret, desperate life. The testimony was expected to be dry, a procedural formality before the closing arguments began. The accountant walked the jury through Layla's bank statements and charitable donations, painting a picture of a woman who, despite living on a modest disability income, was incredibly generous. She gave what little she could to various animal shelters and veterans support groups. The final document presented was a copy of a check, a donation she had written to a local sea turtle rescue center, a check that was dated the day she was murdered but had never been mailed. As the image of the check was displayed on the large screen for the jury to see, a heavy silence fell over the room. It was such a small, mundane thing, a simple act of charity, but in the context of the trial, it felt monumental. It was a perfect, poignant symbol of the life that had been stolen, a life defined by quiet acts of kindness, a life that was still thinking of others, even in its final hours. It was a testament to a future that would never happen, a small, tangible piece of a life cut short. The emotional impact of this simple piece of evidence was unexpected and overwhelming. It was the straw that broke the camel's back. In the jury box, a middle-aged woman, a school teacher who had remained stoic throughout the most gruesome testimony, suddenly broke down. She covered her face with her hands and began to sob, her body shaking with a grief that was raw and uncontrollable. The jurors' tears were a silent, powerful verdict. They were not tears of pity for the defendant or of confusion over the facts. They were tears of pure, unadulterated sorrow for the victim, a recognition of the immense and irreplaceable loss that Layla King's death represented. Her emotional breakdown was a release of the tension and horror that had been building in the courtroom for weeks, a human response to an inhuman act. The judge, seeing the jurors' distress, immediately called for a recess. As the other jurors awkwardly tried to comfort their weeping colleague and the courtroom began to empty, the moment hung in the air, a turning point that everyone felt but could not articulate. The trial was no longer an intellectual exercise of weighing evidence and applying legal standards. It had become a referendum on human decency, and the sight of that check, that final unmailed act of kindness, had made the verdict emotionally inevitable. Joshua Ramirez watched the scene unfold with a look of utter bewilderment. He could not comprehend the jurors' tears. In his world, emotion was a weakness, a flaw in the system, and the woman's public display of grief was, to him, a sign of the societal decay he was fighting against. He turned to his lawyer, Michael Thorne, and whispered, his voice filled with genuine academic curiosity, "Why is she crying? It's illogical." That simple, chilling question was, in its own way, a more complete confession than his manifesto. It revealed a mind so warped, so completely divorced from the basic tenets of human empathy, that he could not understand why someone would weep for a life so senselessly and cruelly destroyed. His inability to grasp the jurors' tears was the final, definitive proof of the empty space where his soul was supposed to be. The recess was brief, but the atmosphere in the courtroom had been permanently altered when the trial resumed. The breaking point had been reached. The legal arguments and procedural motions that would follow were now just a formality. The heart of the matter had been exposed, not by a lawyer's brilliant argument or a witness's dramatic testimony, but by a simple check for a sea turtle charity and the honest, uncontrollable tears of a juror who recognized that the murder of Layla King was a loss not just for her family, but for the world. The transient culture of the Keys was built on emotional detachment, but in that courtroom, a wave of pure, undeniable emotion had just washed away any doubt that remained. The prosecution and defense had rested their cases, the evidence had been presented, the witnesses had testified, and the jury was preparing to hear the closing arguments. The narrative of the case seemed complete. A lonely, radicalized boy had committed a monstrous act of ideological violence, but prosecutor Edward Morris had held one final devastating card to play, a rebuttal witness whose testimony would reframe the entire tragedy, revealing that Joshua's evil was not a solitary creation, but a poison that had been nurtured in the heart of his own family. The prosecution called its final witness, Sarah Ramirez, Joshua's 16-year-old older sister. She walked to the stand with a reluctance that was painful to watch, a girl caught between an impossible loyalty and a moral duty she could no longer ignore. Her testimony began with simple questions about her brother, his isolation, and his descent into the world of online extremism. But it was when Morris asked her about the days leading up to the murder that the final, horrifying truth was revealed. With tears streaming down her face, Sarah Ramirez confessed that she had known about her brother's plan. She explained that Joshua, in his own cold and detached way, had told the entire family about his manifesto and his intention to make a statement. He had laid out his philosophy of hate at the dinner table, explaining the necessity of his planned actions with the same passionless logic he had used on his lawyer and the police. The family's complicity was a revelation that sucked the air out of the courtroom. The jury, the judge, and the gallery listened in stunned silence as a sibling revealed the entire family knew about the defendant's plans and did nothing to stop them, either from fear or a twisted sense of loyalty. Sarah explained that her parents were terrified of Joshua, of his cold rages and his intellectual bullying. They had chosen to believe he was simply fantasizing, that his talk of murder was just a phase, an adolescent cry for attention that was too horrifying to be taken seriously. It was not a conspiracy of active participants, but a conspiracy of silence, a catastrophic failure of parental responsibility born from a mixture of fear and willful denial. They had seen the monster growing in their own home, had listened to him detail his plans for a brutal murder, and had chosen to look away, to hope that it would all just go away. Their inaction had been a quiet but fatal endorsement of his plan, a green light for him to proceed with his act of terror. Sarah's testimony was the ultimate betrayal, but it was also an act of profound courage. She admitted that she too had been scared to challenge Joshua, but that her conscience could no longer bear the weight of her silence. She looked at her parents in the gallery, their faces etched with a mixture of shame and fury, and then looked at the jury. She told them that her brother was not a victim of brainwashing, but a willing and enthusiastic student of hate, and that her family, through their cowardice, had become his first and most important enablers. The true target of Joshua's ideology, she explained, was not just the outside world, but his own family. His manifesto was a tool of domestic terror, his philosophy of strength a weapon he used to dominate and control his parents and sibling. He had created a cult of one within their home, and they had become his first unwilling followers. The murder of Layla King was not just an attack on a stranger, it was the ultimate act of control over his own family, an act so monstrous it would bind them to his evil forever. During his sister's testimony, Joshua's calm facade finally and completely shattered. This was a betrayal he could not rationalize, an attack from within his own fortress. He stood up and screamed at her, calling her a traitor and a liar, his voice the high-pitched shriek of a wounded child, not a cold-blooded ideologue. It was the first genuine, uncontrolled emotion he had shown throughout the entire trial, and it was an emotion of pure narcissistic rage at having his power challenged. The judge ordered the bailiffs to restrain Joshua as his outburst devolved into a string of profanities and threats. The final revelation was complete. The story of Joshua Ramirez was not the story of a lone wolf, it was the story of a dysfunctional and terrified family that had allowed a predator to flourish in their midst. His parents had not created the monster, but they had fed it with their silence, and Layla King had paid the price for their failure. The jury now saw the case in a new and even more tragic light. Joshua was undeniably guilty, a creature of his own making, but his evil had been allowed to grow in a garden of neglect and fear. The final twist was not about a hidden accomplice or a secret motive, it was about the quiet, mundane, and catastrophic failure of a family to confront the darkness in their own home. The transient culture of the Florida Keys was full of people who had run away from their families, but the Ramirez family had stayed together and in doing so had created a prison of fear that had ultimately unleashed a monster upon the world. The jury's deliberation was remarkably swift. After weeks of testimony and the final shocking revelation of his family's complicity, they returned with a guilty verdict on all counts, including first-degree murder, in just under 2 hours. The verdict was a formality. The true drama of the day would come during the sentencing phase, when the legal system would render its final judgment on the 13-year-old killer who had terrorized a community and shattered the illusion of childhood innocence. At the sentencing hearing, the courtroom was once again filled to capacity, the air thick with a grim sense of finality. Prosecutor Edward Morris argued passionately for the maximum possible sentence, life in prison without the possibility of parole. He spoke of the meticulous planning, the chilling lack of remorse, and the profound, hateful ideology that drove Joshua Ramirez. He argued that Joshua was not a child who had made a mistake, but a fully formed predator whose capacity for evil was so great that he could never safely be returned to society. The defense attorney, Michael Thorne, made a weary and heartfelt plea for leniency. He spoke of Joshua's age, of the family's catastrophic failure to intervene, and of the corrosive influence of online extremism. He asked the judge to consider the possibility of rehabilitation, to leave open a door, however small, for the boy who might still exist somewhere beneath the monstrous facade. It was a speech born more of professional duty than of genuine hope, a final, futile argument against the overwhelming evidence of his client's depravity. Before the judge handed down the sentence, the family of Layla King was given the opportunity to deliver their final victim impact statements. Layla's mother spoke first, her voice quiet but strong, a testament to a spirit that refused to be broken by grief. She spoke not of hatred or revenge, but of the beautiful legacy of kindness her daughter had left behind, a legacy that would live on in the countless lives she had touched. Then it was time for the judge to pronounce the sentence. The judge, a man known for his calm and measured demeanor, looked down from the bench, his gaze fixed solely on the 13-year-old boy at the defendant's table. He delivered a blistering speech, abandoning his usual judicial restraint to personally condemn Joshua's actions and the poisonous ideology that had spawned them. He spoke of the sanctity of a life given to service and the profound, irredeemable evil of a life dedicated to hate. He then sentenced Joshua Ramirez to life in prison without the possibility of parole, the harshest sentence available for a juvenile offender. As the words were spoken, a wave of quiet relief washed over the gallery. Justice, as much as it could be, had been served. But the final act of the drama belonged to Joshua himself. As the bailiffs moved to escort him from the courtroom, Joshua's face, which had been a mask of sullen indifference, twisted into a final, defiant sneer. He turned, his eyes locking with the weeping family of Layla King. Then, in a final, chilling act of performative hatred, he laughed, a loud, ugly, cackling sound that echoed in the stunned silence of the room. He spat on the floor in the direction of the jury box and screamed a final, chilling threat at Layla's family as he was dragged from the courtroom, fighting and kicking like a cornered animal. The final defiant act was a perfect and horrifying encapsulation of his entire being. There was no remorse, no self-pity, no flicker of understanding of the gravity of his actions. There was only hate, pure, undiluted, and performative, a final broadcast of his monstrous ideology to the world that had dared to hold him accountable. He was not leaving the courtroom as a child sentenced to a lifetime of regret, but as a martyr for his own twisted cause, a soldier being led from a battlefield where, in his own mind, he had already won. The courtroom doors swung shut behind him, leaving a silence that was heavier and more profound than any that had come before. The legal battle was over, but the questions it had raised would linger for years. How does a child become a monster? Where does the responsibility of a family begin and end? And how does a society confront an evil that is so young, so intelligent, and so utterly convinced of its own righteousness? There were no easy answers. There was only the memory of a good woman's life, the chilling sound of a young boy's laughter, and the grim reality of a prison cell that would be his home for the rest of his natural life. The transient culture of the Florida Keys had seen its share of broken people, but it had never seen anyone as thoroughly and irrevocably shattered as the 13-year-old boy who had mistaken a life sentence for a victory.